Dobrze, drodzy Państwo, tak więc mamy rozpoczęte.
Ladies and gentlemen, the recording is on, and in a second we are going to begin our seminar.
Uwaga, rozpoczynam webinar. Drodzy Państwo, w imieniu
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, I'd like to welcome you at our seminar. My name is Łukasz Płocki, and I'm the director of the office of the foundation, and I'm the manager of the project devoted to the Janusz Kurtyka Awards. And as part of this project, we are meeting today, and we celebrate the awards that were given to Professor Andrzej Nowak, the Forgotten Appeasement of 1920, Lloyd George, Lenin and Poland. This book was published in English thanks to the Routledge Publishing House, and that's why we are going to discuss the topic related to the forgotten appeasement of 1920. And we are going to discuss different issues related to the association with appeasement, namely invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I'd like to introduce our guests, Professor Andrzej Nowak. Welcome, Professor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Witamy, Panie Profesorze.
Welcome, Professor. And Professor Nowak, as you know, already is the author of the book mentioned today. He is a historian, a Sovietologist, who specializes in the history of Eastern Europe and Poland, especially focusing on the First and the Second World War. And he published more than 200 scholarly articles and reviews and over 30 books, and was awarded the Janusz Kurtyka Award in 2020. And we would like to welcome Professor Jay Winter as well. Professor is also a historian associated with the Yale University, specializes in the events of the First World War and its impact on the 20th century history. He's the author of more than 20 publications, honoris causa of Graz University, Paris University, and we would like to welcome Professor wholeheartedly, and we are grateful that you would present your views, and we hope for discussion afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, before we focus on the speech and discussion, and I would like to thank the organizer of today's event, which is co-funded as part of the project of the Polish Minister of Science and Education, the Scholarship and Social Responsibility project, now over. Not yet to Professor Jan Winter. I'd like to say a few words of introduction as regards the Janusz Kurtyka Award. Why am I mentioning it? It is the flagship project of our foundation. Why? Because our foundation realizes that history and historiography focusing on a contemporary period is not well recognized abroad. And we believe that it is mainly due to the fact that books and publications by Polish historians are not always available in English or other foreign languages. Therefore, as part of this project, we believe it is worthwhile to offer translation of recognized historical books, and together with publishing houses abroad, we translate and publish these books and organize meetings such as today's meeting. And this is it as regards the introduction. And let us move to Professor Jan Winter. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm here today to celebrate Andrzej Nowak's book, The Forgotten Appeasement of 1920, with the subtitle Lloyd George, Lenin and Poland, first published in 2015 in Polish, and now available in an English edition through Routledge. Professor Nowak is the fourth winner of the Janusza Kurtyki Award, bestowed on authors of distinguished works in Polish history. The prize, I needn't say to those in our circle, but need to say to many others, is named for the late Janusz Kurtyka, historian and second president of the Polish Institute for National Remembrance. Kurtyka was among the 96 men and women killed in the crash of the Tupolev Tu-154 flight at Smolensk North on the 10th of April, 2010. Professor Nowak, as most of you know, is very well known internationally. He is the author of a still in progress multi-volume history of Poland. I believe, Professor Nowak, you've reached the middle of the 17th century or perhaps gone further. The volume 6 of a planned 11. This is an extraordinary achievement. You are as well the author of 20 books, many in the chosen field of Eastern European and Russian history, and for 18 years served as the editor-in-chief of the cultural political review Arcana. Your presence in Polish cultural life is undisputed and distinguished. May I congratulate you, Professor Nowak, on your lifetime achievement as one of the leading historians of your generation throughout the world. It is an honor for me to engage in this discussion with you. Now, the book we address today is an angry book. It is a deeply researched and penetrating historical study. It was, I believe, completed at the time of the West's tepid response to the Russian seizure and annexation of Crimea. But it is not only and not primarily a book about the morass created in 2014, a morass now extending throughout Europe and indeed threatening to engulf the world. It is a book about appeasement, the use of that word and its consequences. Now, on page 121 of the book, Professor Nowak, you put the question absolutely clearly. And you start initially with a British focus, but the ramifications are multiple and profound. The question is, how did the political, liberal, and conservative elite of a Western power develop the idea of appeasing the appetite of the Soviet Communist Empire at the cost of Poland and other small states of Eastern and East Central Europe? How do particular appeasement strategies come to life? The formulation is characteristic of the excellence of the book. Now, the answer to the question, I believe, and I look forward to your response, Professor Nowak, is subtle and supported by massive documentation. Appeasement, you argue, came out of ignorance and imperial insouciance. Lloyd George, Curzon, and the rest of the British ruling class had not the slightest idea what the Bolshevik Revolution meant. They were the blind leading the blind. One British journalist stationed in Moscow in 1918 summed up this tendency. In fact, a journalist relied upon by the London Times more than any other, summed up this tendency to replace judgment with completely empty prose by describing Leon Trotsky in these words. He called him a four-square son of a bitch, but the greatest Jew since Jesus Christ. That kind of rhetoric, that kind of reportage helps account for the confusion and ignorance in which policy discussions occurred. Now, a second source of the tendency to appease was, I believe, and I think this is your view as well, the British preference for imperial diplomacy, that is to say, empire to empire, having small states fall in line as they have to do, rather than as they would if justice were observed. Better to stabilize the East through a settled arrangement with whomever was in power in Moscow and Petrograd, rather than to deal with smaller states just emerging from imperial domination. Now, at this point, I think you touch on a larger issue that underlay the failure of the entire post-war settlement. The source of appeasement in 1920, in my view, and I look forward to hearing your response, was imperial overreach. By 1920, the interwar depression was a global reality. Economic historians are unified in their view of the break in the middle of 1920. Britain suffered from its effects earlier than France, though both were confronted by an uncomfortable realization. It came out of this. Victory in 1918 was both the apogee and the beginning of the end of British and French imperial power. There's the contradiction. Recognition of this tectonic shift in geopolitics would take decades to sink in, but the first premonitions of the provincialization of Western Europe were heard in these years. Paul Valéry announced that Western civilization had learned through the butchery of the Great War that our political and social institutions and ideas are mortal. They live lives that come to an end. All that killing, Ezra Pound, the Italian-American poet, intoned, for a botched civilization, an old bitch gone in the teeth. Now, imperial overreach describes the collision between the contraction of economic and military power, because military power depends upon economic power, and the expansion of imperial appetites anyway. There is the delusion, the set of illusions that undermined the Versailles settlement of 1918. For Britain, the Great War was an entirely Pyrrhic victory. The Great War impoverished Britain, even though no one admitted it at the time. The Second World War virtually bankrupted her. The same was true for France, whose rentier class settled heavily in Paris, from which I'm speaking today. The French rentier class was absolutely devastated by the loss of around 1/5 of their portfolio of overseas investments in Russia. The Bolsheviks had no intention of giving them back, and lawyers are still working today, actually, to reassert the rights of those who lost at least some of their shirts in the Russian Revolution. Now, the only way for France to pay the huge costs of the pensions owed to over 2 million disabled veterans, widows, and orphans was to force Germany to hand over huge sums in reparations. But that couldn't happen. It is another contradiction of the peace settlement, and I think the underbelly of appeasement was that inflation wiped out the real value of what Germany paid and meant that the economic foundations of the new political order were built on sand. The imperial peace became, in many respects, a hollow and a debtor's peace, not the imperial peace of 1815 or indeed of 1870, which were the previous precedents on which peacemakers could rest their work. Now, it's my view, I hope you share it, that we are now in a second era of globalization. The first one ended in 1914, and it took 40 years for there to be technical change and the, as it were, impulse and momentum of development to pick it up again. But despite the end of the first era of globalization in the First World War, Britain and France still acted as if they could parcel out the contested territories in Eastern Europe and the Middle East as if they were acting as executors to a very substantial will that had to be distributed among a host of warring siblings, mourning the death of 4 empires that had lost the war. Now, the problem is there wasn't such an inheritance or a legacy to pass on. And without that material basis, the grounds for appeasement were born. That is, in effect, my view. And I'm very interested to hear whether you see it as consistent with your interpretation. The challenge to imperial appetites, British and French, and Russian for that matter, came from America, from self-determination as defined by Wilson, or ill-defined by Woodrow Wilson, I should say. But Lloyd George and Clemenceau didn't have to worry because the United States Senate destroyed that particular threat to British and French imperial mastery, as it did destroy the League of Nations as a whole. The British Admiralty cheered on the US Senate, since by blocking any American action to guarantee the peace or support the survivors of the Armenian genocide, for example, they eliminated the possibility of an American naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean that they didn't want at all. It appeared after the Second World War, but it didn't appear after the First. The point, imperial overreach, which is my central theme, is the first of the explanations, I believe, necessary to create the, I think, force and power of the interpretation of your clinical analysis of Western appeasement in 1920. The second point, though, I'd like to put to you is that your argument is also very revealing in the extent to which it shows that appeasement came out of a mix of exhaustion and lassitude. The first is physical. The second is mental, psychological, moral, one might argue. And what both meant, what they added up to, was that the British ruling class had neither the strength, nor the backbone, nor the will to imagine going to war again in 1920 over anything. Britain was still in the middle of a civil war in Ireland, not completed, and it was of infinitely greater significance to the men of Whitehall than was Russia, Poland, or the entire east of Europe. Ireland was an intrinsic and soon to be removed limb of the British state. And this notion of exhaustion and lassitude must extend to the ruling elite, and in particular, the man at the top, Lloyd George. The Liberal Party, which was his from the early 1900s, was engaged in an internal civil war largely of his own making. It is possible to say that he killed his own party in a number of different ways, but the outcome of that civil war isolated Lloyd George in 1920 at home, and then afterwards consigned his party to the political wilderness until today. He's a man whose victory basically destroyed the political movement that had brought him to power. Now, by 1920, there was no significant part of the British or the French population that was prepared to tolerate going to war, whether it's over Russia, over Poland, or anywhere else for that matter. And on the contrary, and I think this is an interesting point, the trade union movement in both countries with virtually no sympathy for Bolshevism in Britain at all, and only a superficial solidarity in France, threatened a general strike should either government send an expeditionary force to Russia or Poland. After all, they had already done it in 1918-19, and it was a failure. It was a complete failure. The Allied intervention of 1918 and 19 was such a wonderful, shall we say, prelude to Vietnam. People going to a place they didn't understand for purposes that could not be achieved, and ultimately were withdrawn and to let the locals suffer accordingly. British and French troops provoked fears of a return of aristocratic landowners coming back, thereby helping to solidify popular support for the Bolsheviks. It was the last thing in the world that the Allies should have tried. Quarantine was a face-saving device that cost nothing and achieved nothing. Waging war, supporting the waging of war against the Bolsheviks was simply beyond the political horizons of both Britain and France in 1920. Now, these powers did not so much appease Moscow as turn their backs on both sides of the Russian Civil War. And it's happened so many times that I think your book has echoes of multiple registers that we need to talk about later. I think what we have to say is that this book, and the reason why I'm honored to speak of it as this year's prize winner, is an essential book for our framing of an understanding of the period between 1918 and 1939. I think the argument takes the refusal to challenge Hitler at Munich in 1938 or Stalin at Yalta as almost Weberian ideal types of appeasement. And there are very strong reasons for adopting this position that go on until today. But I would like to ask about what I would call a counterpoint to the interpretation. I wonder, though, is this: is it the case that the monstrous nature of the Bolshevik regime was either already fixed in stone or entirely true at that time? I'm not a Soviet historian, and I very much look forward to hearing your views about this. But I have followed not only Sheila Fitzpatrick on Russia, but Ian Kershaw on Germany, on the view of a progressive radicalization in totally immoral terms of the dictatorships in both cases, of a ratcheting up of the violence against the people, literally of the, as Pasternak put it, making when the revolution froze. The question is, was it frozen already in 1920? And I very much believe that there are multiple answers to that question. I'm not at all sure. 1920 is still before the Kronstadt uprising, triggered by food and fuel shortages alongside deep disillusionment with the non-democratic nature of the Bolshevik regime. The authorities announced the end of war communism and signed the Treaty of Riga within days of the suppression of the revolt. There were too many moving pieces in play in the mechanism of the revolution for anyone to be absolutely certain what would be the outcome. I'm not sure how valuable you see Misha Levin's account of Lenin's testament. Maybe it was said, Krupskaya, maybe it was said to others, but there are multiple possibilities there. And it's those multiple possibilities are those that I'd like to ask you about. Is it surprising that Western leaders trying to fortify the extremely shaky international peace settlement they had built would look at the Polish-Bolshevik conflict and declare a plague on both your houses? They were simply making a virtue of a necessity rather than seeing what was to come. Now, there's a word or two as well I'd like to add to your portrayal, which is just, completely just. In fact, I think I probably would go further on both Curzon and Lloyd George. Curzon was a man whose effortless command, not only of rhetorical English, he spoke full paragraphs, but also of imperial matters, had placed his vision at the center of British foreign policy for decades. But after the war, he was a spent force. The empire, very much like the empire, whose pretensions and Orientalism, indeed, it's what David Cannadine calls ornamentalism, he embodied. He was the man of the empire, in my view, which had just about begun its terminal decline. He also was in constant pain, suffering from an incurable skeletal deformation. He had hoped to be named conservative prime minister when his party finally jettisoned Lloyd George, but that was not to be the case. He was a man with a very brilliant future behind him and succumbed to kidney disease just 2 years later. He hated Bolshevism, but saw it as a nuisance and not the menace it came to be. Imperial visionaries took dictatorships as nuisance, and I think the link with Munich is absolutely clear. Now, Lloyd George was an entirely different political animal. He was utterly unscrupulous. Colleagues used to quip that after every meeting with him, they checked to see whether their wallets were still where they should be. His sexual immorality was hidden by a tolerant press and an opposition still working on the Victorian assumptions about what a gentleman was and wasn't. And Lloyd George definitely wasn't a gentleman. Drawing a veil of discretion over his personal life was part of the British Constitution, as Bagehot put it. And as we have seen in the case of the royal family to this day, it has taken a century for this discretion to finally wither away. Lloyd George chose appeasement, I believe, in 1920, not because he was immoral, but because he was impotent politically. He had no party, no friends, and no political following. He wasn't the head of a movement. He was a charismatic leader in Weberian's term, not a substantive political leader. And like Tony Blair today, every time Lloyd George in 1920 went in one direction, virtually the whole political world in Britain went in the other direction. He was a man not to be trusted over anything. How different are the scenes in Munich and Yalta? Very different. Both are instances of cowardice and the betrayal of any principle of peace or justice. That I think we're agreed on. In my view, though, and I'd like to hear your reply, Riga was not the same. It was a moment when Britain, France, and the Bolsheviks faced devastating choices. Poland was a reality, a new and vibrant state that had stared down enemies on all sides and won the right to self-determination. The tragedy was that that state of affairs lasted initially only for 2 decades. But the war of the behemoths, that was the menace at Munich, and the division of the spoils of victory, and indeed the Cold War that preoccupied the men at Yalta, was nowhere evident in 1920. History rarely has direct lines. Kant preferred crooked ones. And I just wonder whether the line between Riga, Munich, and Yalta is a bit more crooked than your book suggests. Despite voicing these thoughts, I want to conclude that there are truths in your prize-winning book that cannot be ignored. Trade does not civilize. That old 19th century British idea of Cobden and Bright has got to be faced for the untruth that it is. Trade does not moralize or international relations. Making money and making war go hand in hand. Indeed, in comparison, the Western recourse to sanctions after Putin's seizure of the Crimea in 2014 looks much worse in retrospect than the British and French incompetent maneuverings in 1920 and 1921. Now, all I can do is to say it is my absolute fervent hope that the economic strength and political determination of the Western alliance will do what economic weakness and lassitude could not do in 1920-21. That is to degrade and destroy the Russian military and to discredit Putin's regime to the point that it is incapable ever again of waging war on civilians, of attacking hospitals and homes, of committing monstrous crimes against humanities. Substituting the word achievement for appeasement and courage and candor for condescension must be the order of the day. May I thank you once again, Professor Novak, for providing us with a work of history of the highest order, a work that shows that we historians are indeed engaged in a branch of moral philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really hard to say anything after this, these words from the most venerated historian of this beginning of the 21st century, at least by myself. So I really feel dizzy from success after your words. Just like Stalin described that illness in early 30s. But being quite serious, I'm really extremely grateful for your kind, much too kind words actually about myself and my work. But I am especially thankful for your incisive comments and questions and a kind of provocations for a kind of scholarly polemic. That's something that might serve well further development of our discussion. But the first point is of, I believe, fundamental agreement between us. That is, that history is not totally abstract study of numbers, units that have no connection with contemporary issues that engage our passions. That sometimes, of course, sometimes history is simply a study of, as Michael Oakeshott said, comparable to your love for a long death mistress. But sometimes that mistress is very much alive and kicking ourselves. That's why I believe that the kind of work which I presented, and it was translated thanks to the foundation of Janusz Kurtyka, my late friend, belongs to that category of history which is to a degree engaged. That's a very dangerous word, I agree. There are many traps on this way of producing engaged history. But I think there is a narrow path in which we can try at least to stay faithful to academic standards, so to speak, of dealing with sources and always responding to strong veto presented by some sources that our interpretation cannot go as far because sources say something different. But at the same time, to put our knowledge of a particular chapter of history into the context of contemporary issues that engage us seems to me sometimes inevitable. And that's why I made that introduction to the book, which presents it clearly that that's my position. It could be criticized, it could be rejected, but that's my position. So in that respect, I think we don't disagree that there is such a possibility to use history as a kind of example of issues that we still deal with, and these examples can give us food for thinking, for reflecting on our contemporary attitudes, on our contemporary issues. But following to your main points, if I noted them correctly, I would start with imperial overreach. I agree with that interpretation completely. That was the reason maybe number one of reaction and lack of reaction on the part of victorious powers after World War I. The question, which seems to me very interesting, and it is exactly Professor Winter's observation that makes me thinking about that, is the relation between expectations of these newcomers, so to speak, figuratively, to international arena, and those guarantors, those powers or superpowers in terms of 1920, possibilities. Poland, along with many other countries of East Central Europe, belonged to a group of countries that believed or pretended maybe, but some of the Polish citizens surely believed in a kind of vision presented by Versailles Peace, by Wilson points, as a kind of promise. Promise that was not to be fulfilled fully due to limitations of capabilities of the victorious powers. And this relationship between expectations, promise, and real capabilities of world powers to keep the highest standard of their vision of peace is something that also recurs even today. We believe in some set of standards, human rights, international legal order, and so on and so forth. But finally, we have to somehow confront our expectations with realities where, so to speak, evil powers also have, or forces have potential, have agency, sometimes stronger than those, at least in determination, than those defending this promised land of peace and prosperity, to put it simply. So that is history yet to be written, I think, of this interaction between expectations, hopes of the peoples from Eastern Europe, those more lucky people that had a chance to organize their own statehoods after 1918, because there were also unlucky peoples that didn't make it, as Ukrainians or Belarusians and some others as well. So I am now narrowing that perspective to this group of, so to speak, lucky people, among whom or among which Poland was probably one of the greatest in this group of peoples that termed themselves victorious after World War I. And I observed, dealing with sources of British, especially British statesmen conduct in 1919, 1920, and early 1921, exactly that feeling of lassitude and, to put it simply, I can use a metaphor of Lord Lothian, that is private secretary of Lloyd George, Philip Kerr, who wrote in the end of 1920 that we are not capable, we, that is United Kingdom, of playing that role of Atlas of the world order by ourselves alone. We have to have someone else to help us. We are not powerful enough to keep all this mess, which is not the sky. It is rather a mess that we keep on our shoulders, and we would not be able to do it by ourselves. So that feeling of overreach came, I believe, very quickly in 1919 actually, in the elections in France and in the United Kingdom. And this was not observed, that this was not realized quickly enough on our part, so to speak, that is Eastern European viewers were not informed about the extent of that exhaustion, actually, of Western European victorious societies, so to speak. So that's the point in which I completely agree with you, and I think that there is simply a point to start new research comparing for example, Czechoslovak perspective, Romanian perspective, Lithuanian perspective, exactly on the same level of expectations, fulfilled and unfulfilled promises on the side of Western powers and their limited capabilities after 1920. However, when we talk about possibilities, and I tried to think at least about lost possibilities in 1920. I can quote an example of a thinker that produced something like an answer at least worth considering. That is Halford Mackinder and his democratic ideals and reality, his book from 1919, addressed exactly to the statesmen that gathered in Versailles. And this is not just about heartland and these several keywords of geopolitics. It's much more interesting when you read it full. It is a full project of engaging forces of victorious powers into new order that should be based not exclusively on their own strength, but should treat seriously that part of the world that somehow was for the first time since at least 18th century again on the map of Europe as independent or hoping to be independent source of political will, that is Eastern Europe, stretching from Finland to Bulgaria, which was not produced by World War I, but still was relatively fresh phenomenon on the map of Europe. So he linked that concept of investing not just army, not just military powers in 1920, though he was himself very much engaged in that project, which I describe very briefly in a paragraph of my book. But he considered a long-term kind of strategic investment, both in making this middle tier, as he called that stretch of states from Scandinavia, Eastern Scandinavia, through Baltic states to the Balkans, with Poland and Czechoslovakia as the key countries in that middle tier, to invest there not just, I would say, strategic defense, but also economic investment. Of course, Professor Winter already said about the limitations of such possibilities after 1920. Economic crisis, inflation, that ate, so to speak, these possibilities of using economy effectively as a world order tool. The issues that the democratic leaders in France or in England or United Kingdom had to deal at home were so pressing that simply the dream of Mackinder was not easy to realize. But some of his thoughts could be repeated, at least in the context of 1939 and 1945. That is exactly that due to strategic importance of that region between Russia, to put it geopolitically simple, Bolshevik Russia, White Russia, Putin's Russia, whatever Russia there exists, as long as it is Imperial Russia, and Germany, as long as it is imperial, and in those times, that is early 20th century, this imperial specter of Germany or specter of imperial Germany was something inevitable in thinking of, so to speak, statesmen of that era. So as long as that danger of imperial Russia and imperial Germany exists, this is exactly that middle tier of states between them that should be invested with, especially Anglo-Saxon powers, long-term, not just loans, but also, I would say, cultural, economic, military, strategic interest. And this was contrary to something that Professor J. Winter is the greatest specialist in the world, I believe, that is memory culture. These countries did not exist. I mean, East Central European countries did not exist or barely existed in I would say, cultural memories, or I would put it differently, political, cultural imagination of leading elites of Western European countries. While to the contrary, Russia and especially Germany existed very strongly, both as enemies, but also as possible allies or partners, maybe if not allies, then at least partners in rebuilding order. So that that idea to infuse Western European or Anglo-Saxon, transatlantic, whatever you call that, that axis, statesmen of early 20th century, with the idea that Eastern Europe matters, that countries between Russia and Germany mattered, was very difficult actually to achieve. What actually the victory of Polish armies in 1920 gave against the Red Army to that region, or part of that region, was 2 decades of a chance to make this region more visible in the imagination of Western European statesmen. But 2 decades were too short again. Now we have something like a next try, more than 3 decades, with Ukraine present, which is extremely important. And now Ukraine is even more present than any other country from that group of countries, exactly through the interest connected with the war that Putin initiated against Ukraine. But still, I see this exactly in that chain of, so to speak, figuratively speaking, chain of changes that make that vision of Mackinder more realistic now than 100 years ago. So I am not saying that it was possible to be realized, to realize that vision in 1920, but I am saying that to a degree it was prophetic, and that's the only thing which I can counter to very sober opinions of Professor J. Winter, that there was little alternative to what happened in 1920 on the side of Western leaders. But I'm really interested in Professor Winter's development of that subject of Western statesmen. There were no stateswomen at the time. Political imagination, cultural memory, as it developed from that era of post-Great War. Exactly that phenomenon that was described by Anthony Lentin, a British historian, that called the attitude towards Germany among British elite as mea culpism. That is, yes, Germany was our enemy, but Germany is a cultured nation, is a great nation, and we were too harsh to Germany. And who are these Poles? Who are these Ukrainians? Even who are these Russians? Russians are, again, great, important, but they are not that cultured as Germans. So that makes room for exactly appeasement to Germany, because we were too harsh with this great nation, and other nations do not matter, actually. That kind of interplay between cultural imagination, what is taught in universities, what is commented in press, what kind of music is listened to, and identified Stravinsky, Russian composer, or maybe Russian composer of Polish origin. I am developing almost a joke, but you can understand how I try to connect this cultural memory to more political issue of appeasement, actually. So going further, because there were so many fascinating issues taken by Professor Winter, I think that the question concerning the level of, so to speak, aggressiveness or totalitarianism, to use anachronistically that term, of Bolshevik regime in 1919 or 1920 is, of course, a disputable matter, I agree. But it could be measured geographically. The closer you were to the place, so to speak, where this experiment was realized, the more knowledge you had. That was even different in Eastern Poland and Western Poland. In Wielkopolska, Poznań, even in Łódź, it was still a kind of, I would say, bad dream. You don't believe always in bad dreams when you hear someone that tells you details from that dream. But for the inhabitants of Eastern Poland, understood in 1920 terms, where Red Army occupation reached these territories, these were not dreams but realities. And when we speak about Paris, its salons or clubs in London, it was an abstract matter. For conservative, it was obvious that these Bolsheviks are extremely ferocious bastards, sorry for that word. For labors, it was slightly different, but it was abstract anyway on both sides of the debate. To a degree, we can answer to your very, very hard question, whether the Bolshevik regime in 1919 or 1920 revealed its, I would say, potential of cruelty, to put it in the easiest way. I believe that we can answer that to a large degree it had revealed its potential of mass repressions, unlawful, so to speak, mass repressions, aimed not just against political opponents, but sometimes very openly addressed by Lenin. When you read, for example, that selection of Lenin's cables and commentaries that were omitted from his so-called full edition of his works in the Soviet Union, but after that it was published by Richard Pipes, but also in Russia it was published. I forgot the title, it was Unpublished Lenin or something like that. But these are real, authentic sources of Lenin's attitude, and he instructs to put a kind of hybrid actions against Latvia and use pseudo-partisans to hang 100, for example, priests, in order to instill terror just beyond the border. And what to say about the mass killings inside Soviet Russia at that time. Our compatriot, that is Felix Dzierżyński, could be studied in that respect, and is studied in details by Russian historians after 1991. Several interesting volumes of sources were produced about Cheka activities between late 1917 and, let's say, 1921, before Kronstadt. Kronstadt is a breaking point or turning point from the point of view of, I would say, those left-leaning idealists that believed that Lenin could realize democratic leftist dream. But for those who lived in Russia, these illusions were taken slightly before, I believe, Kronstadt tragedy. When you study, for example, diaries of Russian intelligence from that time, several of them were published in past 10, 15 years. Very interesting. Day by day, they observe these changes, these examples of extreme brutality of that regime against left-wing intelligentsia, not just against monarchists, obvious opponents of the regime. So when you take stories of red terror addressed against or after anti-red terror, so to speak, there is always this interplay between two sides of terror in civil war. But the level of these terrors on both sides were so high that at least several 100,000 people lost their lives on both sides. I'm not saying who was worse, who was better, but the red side was really extremely cruel, and it was visible to those who lived close to that terror or experienced that terror. That's why in Poland, at least in part of Poland, that fear of Bolsheviks taking power in Poland was something authentic. At the same time, I can understand that there was no such fear in London or in Paris. And that is always like this. When you experience from close danger of mass killings, you cannot persuade completely those who sit in a safe place, in a comfortable armchair, many hundred miles afar from that. So that's very, I would say, maybe naive, maybe simple-minded answer to the question concerning level of Bolshevik terror in 1920. As regards, by the way, just two examples. For anyone interested in Russian culture, names of Yevgeny Zamyatin or Alexander Blok say something important. And when you look into their private papers from 1919 and 1920, these are papers testifying to a growing despair of very, I would say, fragile cultural personalities that experience totalitarianism avant la lettre. So that's my suggestion to anyone interested in more I would say, in deeper answer to your question, to consult Yevgeny Zamyatin or Alexander Blok papers, commentaries, of course, private papers from that year, 1990 and 1920. But going back to your next question, and maybe I will treat it as the last question. If I omitted some of your questions, you may repeat them, and I will go back to them. But the last question, which I remember and which I wanted to comment was about this line stretching from Riga to Munich to Yalta. Yes, I agree that there is a very big difference, and this path between these three conferences that could be treated theoretically as three examples of or different kinds of appeasement is very crooked, that path. My intention to put that chapter about Riga in that book was exactly to counter a possible accusation against my book or against my simply reasoning that I am addressing my finger against the West. The West is responsible, only the West is bad, and we are saints. We never were faced with that dilemma of appeasing our strong enemy that could be turned into, at least theoretically, into a partner in restoring peace. because that's what peace talks are about restoring peace. And in that moment, your enemy turns into a partner in that process of restoring peace. And there were victims of those peace talks, obviously Ukrainians, Belarusians, and white Russians or anti-Bolshevik Russians, to number just these three examples. So that's why I wanted to analyze that example, trying to weigh differences between that particular type of appeasing your real enemy in real war that was just stopped in October 1920, and a more distant perspective that London or Paris or Washington had to a danger of Bolshevism, or rather Russian imperial aggression under the Red Banner, invading Europe in 1920. Different perspectives, different, I would say, contexts, and yet it seemed to me inevitable to ponder, to reflect, or to invite a reader to reflect upon that particular example. And I am not giving any full answer to that question posed by Professor Winter. It is only an invitation to compare that piece to the appeasement that I described in my book, and further much better studied examples of appeasement, that is of Munich and of Yalta. Because history is so fascinating, and there is no need to reply that here, because it's so different on different occasions, and that makes comparisons so fascinating, because yes, as French saying says, comparaison n'est pas raison, very frequently. So we have to keep it in mind. So that's maybe the last point I wanted to make, but probably I omitted some important points.
Well, thank you very much. And perhaps what we might agree is that we can engage in a number of questions and answers as the third part of the program. For me, questions and answers that I pose are my opening a door and asking you to walk through it. That's and these are invitations. They're less questions than openings for further reflection. The first one concerns your reference to cultural memory. I think one of the reasons why 1920 and appeasement in that period in 1938, much less 1944, 45, is completely different, is because of the revulsion and shock of the mass death of the First World War among the leading victorious powers. To a degree, Britain and France never recovered from the First World War, and they knew it. And they knew it in households throughout the country. They know it in villages where you can still see 5, 6 family names listed on the local small farming village war memorial. Realize the devastation. My question is this. In the immediate aftermath of the war, when Germany had no way to construct an army, that was the reason the blockade continued between the armistice and the peace treaty, where the German army effectively was turned into a series of paramilitary groups by the Treaty of Versailles. The concept of an outbreak of war seemed to have no force because no one could stand adding to the list of the dead. This, I believe, is a difference in the cultural memory of war in the West and in Eastern Europe. And if no one can stand at it, and this is, by the way, Foch's position as to why he believed that the war had to end and not invade Germany, it's because too many people had already died. And there needn't be one additional mother losing one additional son after the German army had called for an armistice. So would it not be possible to say that the rearmament of Germany, the replacement of the Weimar Republic by the Nazis, all of that, and we both understand how cruel and ugly that those circumstances were, was an extremely different configuration, bringing out a possibility of war that people really believed was going to happen. In my view, 1920 was a war that nobody believed would happen in the West. In 1938, I know from the biography I've wrote of the French jurist René Cassin, who begged his family on the Mediterranean coast to leave the Marseille area because they were about to be bombarded within 48 hours. The difference between those two, as it were, emotional moments of terror, is why I see the word appeasement in 1920 as justified, and I've said that in response to your book, but with a completely different inflection in 1938. The same thing I think is true in Yalta or Potsdam, and we could indeed locate it in a number of different places. We could even locate it in 1975, in the final recognition of the western borders of the Soviet Union. The horror of peace was a cultural phenomenon. The horror of war was a cultural phenomenon in 1918, 1920, which is not the same as that which existed in 1938 or in 1944 or 1945. It's for that reason that I think the word is the same, but the meaning is different. Would you share some of that interpretation, or is it still not persuasive?
Thank you again for this incisive commentary and question. Actually, I share completely your position, and I agree with not only with your general expertise, which is so much bigger than mine in that subject, but with your simple argument that the experience of the Great War, I mean World War I, in France especially, but also in the UK, was so shattering that the reason for not considering any realistic option of engaging troops, forces, young boys, surviving young boys, in next adventure abroad was much stronger than even in 1938. However, strong appeasement movement was at that time, both in France and in the UK, because these experiences were simply 20 years back or 18 years back. Whether it is a lot or a little, we can always, if not quarrel, then debate. But I think that again, there is a factor of time and factor of space. And that factor of space could be shown very effectively when we take into consideration advice by Marshal Foch, who was mentioned by Professor Winter, if I understood correctly, to the Polish army vis-a-vis the Bolsheviks. You should wait and see what will happen. You should not fight with them. You should make trenches and do not engage. Sit and wait until the Bolsheviks either decide to attack you or would not do this. And this is exactly, I would say, the experience of World War I that suggested that politics or that strategy rather to Foch and as an advice to Polish army. But at the same time, it was rejected by Piłsudski because he understood that the Bolsheviks would not wait. They are simply driven not by only, I would say, economic, psychological factors that are understandable to Marshal Foch or to French or British politicians of that time. They were driven by ideology. And this was something that especially Lloyd George declined to accept. He simply dismissed ideology as any ideology, actually, as an important factor in, I would say, mass political behavior. And Piłsudski, who knew Lenin personally and knew many Bolsheviks, and himself belonged to that large, so to speak, current of socialist, Second International, I would say left-wing organizations, understood that for some of his ex-comrades, ideology is really important. And when they link that ideology with a specific political culture, as understood by Piłsudski, a kind of despotic, autocratic culture of traditional Russian Tsarist regime that was somehow imbibed by the Bolshevism, according to Piłsudski's interpretation, of course, which, according to some of commentators, was correct. Some would say it was overstated, but still, from that perspective, to sit and wait was unwise, was not possible. And even though Poles, as an ethnic group, lost not that much less than Germans or French in World War I, because roughly 600,000 Polish-speaking, so to speak, soldiers were killed either in Austrian army or Russian or German army. Of course, it was less than French, but not incomparably less, maybe 50% less than average French losses. Nevertheless, it was not that aspect that mattered most, but different space, different, I would say, political, but also psychological context. For the Bolsheviks and masses they driven, the war was not over. The war was only the beginning of something different. And they were capable of instilling either through terror, but also through ideological faith, that perspective into at least hundreds of thousands of their soldiers, if not all 4 million Red Army soldiers were persuaded. I'm sure that at least a large part of that group was somehow driven by these instincts. It is sufficient to read, for example, Isaac Babel's diary, when he comments the beginning of August 1920. Papers from Moscow came. We would start the war against all the world. How happy we are. This is only the beginning of something great. We should invade the West. This is only the beginning of our great journey to the radiant future. Of course, he was political commissar, but he was not alone, I believe, in that perspective. And on Polish side, to put it so primitively, Polish and Bolshevik side, but on Polish side, this hopes for keeping so recently restored statehood was a very important factor that mobilized people to fight, or even to fight offensively, and not just to sit and wait what will happen, just as Marshal Foch advised to Poles. So I would say again that not only time, but also space or particularities of local, so to speak, situation mattered in that respect of perception of appeasement in, let's say, Warsaw, Białystok, or Vilnius, Vilno, whatever you call that beautiful city, and Paris or London in 1920. So that would be my answer.
Well, let me turn to the middle ground, Berlin. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there's again a wide open political and historiographical literature reinforcing the view, I think Eckhart Kerr was one of the first, but he was certainly by no means the last interpreter, that Bolshevism had no chance of being accepted in Germany, whatever, and maybe even more so if there had been a Russian victory in Poland. The current historiography of the German working class movement shows weakness on every level, bitterness and fratricide, clearly on the streets of Berlin. We know that 1,000 workers shot each other, whatever balance it was on one side or the other. Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht dying may have been a heroic gesture, but Rosa Luxemburg didn't think they had much of a chance. And we know this in Munich, we know this all over. It seems to me more reasonable to presume in London and Paris that communism is not coming to Germany than to assume that the Red Army moving across Poland is aiming for Cologne. Would you accept that alternative interpretation, that in a way communism was over in Germany long before it took monstrous form in the Soviet Union?
Mm-hmm. Of course, we would never have a solid answer to that question because
there's the door open.
Yes, yes. But it seems to me revealing to study Soviet perspective, or rather Soviet leadership perspective on that issue in 1920, which is not so unrealistic, I would say. In letters or telegrams sent by Viktor Kopp, Soviet representative in Berlin, to Foreign Affairs Commissariat, so to speak, and to Lenin, he openly stated in actually August, September 1920, that we, that is the Bolsheviks, should rely not only on communists, but also on what he called them, national Bolsheviks.
Yes, that's right.
That is, those who could accept some social radicalism, but the most important motive for them is national revenge. Yes. Against the victors of World War I. And this was a strong motive already in 1920. So a combination of these two groups, true communists, so to speak, that were, yes, defeated. Rosa Luxemburg was that. But as we know, communism was not so unpopular in Germany as, for example, in Poland. Yes. When you compare simply level of support for communist parties in Germany and Czechoslovakia, actually these were two countries with relatively high level of support of communism, only relatively. I am not saying that they were ready to become next Soviet republics, no, but they had some materials to build on, and the Bolshevik leadership understood that this is not enough. That's why they added that national Bolshevik material, that is hopes for revanchist or extreme nationalists or imperialists, whatever you would call them in Germany, that would be ready to accept alliance with, even with Lenin, as long as it helps to destroy Poland and to win against France or these capitalist bastards, imperialist bastards from the Entente.
I understand entirely the Bolshevik point of view. My question is, from London and Paris, appeasement takes Germany as a country that will not go Bolshevik. It is a country that has to be restored, and many different interpretations, the guilt complex about being too harsh, the Carthaginian peace, all of that. But there is a very large body of business opinion to get back to business in Germany. And I think they use, the consular reports are fascinating about this, that the idea of Germany going communist was relatively lightly treated. Maybe this is the interesting point. We now see, as you say, space and time. The difference between the perception of the same events comes to a view that there isn't really a chance of there being a red bridge built across Europe, that Trotsky is dreaming. It's a real dream, but it's a dream that won't happen for the foreseeable future. And for that reason, I'd like to ask you this final question I'd like to put to you is this. Do you think that the concept of socialism in one country is simply, as it were, a fraud, that the real intention was always the ideological mastery of the world, or that the moving within of the violence of the revolution that, in my view, you can see through Akhmatova or Pasternak, for that matter, represents a real change in the nature of Soviet communism, a change that made it cannibalistic, to literally devour its own people, including the Ukrainian people, of course, in the Holodomor. But do you take the interpretation of socialism in one country as simply a front, a sort of covering over, a patina, hiding the revolutionary commitment that still existed? Or was it a real morphology of revolutionary defeat?
Thank you for that. Yet another fascinating question. Actually, as it happened, I just published a book in Polish considering, I would say, Soviet roots of Putinism, to put it figuratively. And in that book, I dealt a lot with the change from Lenin's era to Stalin's era, and exactly the concept of socialism in one country. And studying different sources connected with that issue and also contemporary literature, I found that according to the latest known to me stage of development of discussion over this concept, the concept of socialism in one country was so to speak presented for the first time not by Stalin but by Lenin. So Stalin only developed that concept that arose from necessity. That was not a kind of fundamental change forever, but I would say operational art being placed between tactics and strategy. So it was a kind of operational maneuver that we have to survive for not just 1 month, not just 2 months, but decades, maybe 2 decades. These kind of discussions were ignited, so to speak, exactly after August 1920 in the Bolshevik Politburo. That maybe we had to adjust temporarily, but temporarily meaning not just a very short span of time, but a larger span of time, to a situation that we have to build upon our own resources, that what we already took under our power and influence. And of course, that kind of temporarily adjustment has always its logics. What is temporary tends to become more stable. And this happened exactly with that concept of socialism in one country in early 30s, when Stalin decided to prepare for the next war with the world, basing that preparations not only on communism ideology, communist ideology, but also on a kind of Soviet Russian patriotism or Soviet Russian nationalism, when this Russian center was once again presented to the fore as the core of that mobilization potential for Soviet Russian future military strategic effort. And that particular change that took place exactly in early 30s or mid 30s really changed the meaning of the concept from temporarily to more stable. Of course, for Stalin, towards the end of his days, 1953, he always was a true communist. He believed in world revolution. He didn't believe only in a kind of Russian imperial dream. but he simply adjusted the whole structure, but also to a degree a part of ideology, not the whole ideology, but a significant part of ideology to that new realities when Russia becomes the center for a long time, not some future center in Berlin of communism or somewhere else in Western Europe, but this is Moscow. That is the center of that particular dream of the new world. And this change, of course, interacted with very long, again, subject for your competence, cultural memory of Russian ruling elites, the concept of Moscow, the third Rome. I know that this is very frequently rejected as a kind of shibboleth with no meaning, but I rather disagree with such an easy rejection of that tradition. It exists so strongly in many aspects of Russian culture. You mentioned Pasternak, you mentioned Akhmatova, but you can mention Pushkin, you can mention Dostoevsky, you can mention, well, even Tolstoy. Dita Bojanowska from Yale University now comments exactly about this relatively forgotten aspect of Tolstoy work. So I think that that particular interplay between communism and Russian tradition that was initiated by Lenin with much more powerful stress put still on communist ideology and as quick as possible link to the world of that revolution only started in Russia through the realities of 2 decades being centered exactly around one former Tsarist state that existed for centuries in a particular geopolitical and geo-ideological and geocultural, I would say, dimension, turned that idea of a revolution in one country as socialism in one country, sorry, as a kind of important element that influenced the concept of communism for the rest of the 20th century, actually, to the end of the Soviet Union, because of course now it's different. Putin never accepts communism as his own ideology, yet he accepts a lot from Stalin, especially in his vision of the place of Russia and its potential to mobilize Russian, so to speak, sympathizers outside of Russia. By the way, just one quick commentary to your previous very interesting, and this would be the end of my talkativeness, to your previous observation dealing with lassitude, with this shock of losing so many millions or hundreds of thousands of people in the war. The danger of new carnage is something that is again used as a tool of those who want to play on appeasement. And this was affected, of course, by Hitler in 1938 very well from his point of view. And it is tested, it is testing now by Putin when he suggests from time to time that we are on the brink of atomic Armageddon, actually. So that perspective is still with us. That makes some followers to Putin's vision. We should not play with the danger. We should allow him to keep part of Ukraine. It's better red than dead. Better Putin's making his way than that provoking him to use nuclear weapons. So sorry, that's
no, not at all. We're close to the time that we have to close. Yeah. My final question is this. If you compare the Treaty of Riga with all of the treaties that ended conflict in 1918 to 23, it actually doesn't appear to be the worst of the treaties. In some ways, it may be one of those that permitted the period of flowering of the Polish state and society, whereas we cannot say the same if we deal with Hungary, with Saint-Germain. We cannot do the same when we deal with Turkey in Lausanne, and we cannot say the same about the Weimar Republic, which was, it's at war with itself from the very beginning, a candle being burnt from both ends. Would you agree that Riga actually comes out as the least ugly of the daughters of the First World War?
Thank you. That's very flattering to Polish and, well, Soviet diplomacy from 1921. But actually, it's hard to answer to a Polish historian, I would say, to that question. But I think that it could be interesting to ask not only Ukrainian or Belarusian historians that have their say, probably contrary to your point, but to Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian, even though many of them would not treat Riga as their treaty, yet I am sure and I am ready to defend that point that Riga guaranteed their existence for 20 years. And for these three nations, it was evidently a very benefactory element for the development of independent Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians. Of course, for Poles, that's obvious, but with Belarusians and Ukrainians, again, it is not completely easy to answer that it was only negative. As I suggest, division of Ukraine and of Belarus through that, or partition of Belarus and Ukraine by that treaty, still enabled a kind of interplay of two different politics in ethnic, so to speak, matters on both sides. For some time, it played for the benefit of Ukrainian and Belarusian culture on the Soviet side, so-called not enrootment, sorry, I forgot the word. Koreanizacja, yes, that's the word. That is enrootment, actually, policy that was stopped only by Stalin at a very cruel way, of course, with mass killings in mid-30s. But in that time, in mid-30s, at least Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland could survive without mass persecutions. I mean, the end of 30s or the second half of 30s. So I know that that's very, I would say, subversive way of defending Riga by defending a kind of division of two nations. Yet, just as the experience of Poles under partitions, sometimes it was, well, not that bad that we had, for example, Austrian part of partition, and we were not all under, let's say, Russia, or not all under Bismarck. So this kind of niceties of divisions could be also inserted into answer to your very serious question. But my main point is ask in Vilnius, Tallinn, and Riga. And now this answer, I'm sure, would be rather positive.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. It simply allows me to conclude by saying what I think our conversation has shown is the achievement of your book is to put questions that concern Poland in a global framework, and not only a European one, but a global framework. And I believe that is indeed the purpose of the Janusza Kurtyka Foundation. So I feel very much that I have engaged not only with conversation with one of the world's great historians, but also justified the honor that you have received. Everyone listening to this conversation will know why. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you so much for your extremely kind words. Thank you. It's a great honor to me. Thank you. So thank you and goodbye. Someday, goodbye. Maybe in Krakow or anywhere else, London, yes. Paris, or New Hampshire. Thank you.
Ja bardzo również chciałem w imieniu Fundacji podziękować panom za to, za panu.
Let me also thank you, dear guests, for your participation in this meeting. And during this session, I a bit expected that there would be two different speeches and a bridge of questions in between them. But what we witnessed was a genuine discussion of renowned historians, for which I am extremely grateful. And we hope for other meetings. So please follow our website of our Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, where we inform about further meetings. You can also purchase the book by Professor Andrzej Nowak and other publications. And I would like to thank Ministry of Science and Education for their generous support. And you can listen to the recording using YouTube, and you can follow us in the future. Thank you very much and see you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you so much. Goodbye. Thank you.